My name is Mark McAndrew. I'm a partner with Taft, Stettinius & Hollister, based out of Cincinnati, but we have an office up here in Cleveland as well as Columbus and in Dayton. My practice essentially consists of working with healthcare vendors, health IT companies, a lot of pharma and device companies, do a lot of work in the corporate and commercial transaction space, as well as a lot of regulatory and compliance work. I was excited when Jacqueline asked me to come and participate here at the BioEnterprise event, simply because, I know Cleveland's environment and atmosphere here with a number of healthcare companies, and so I'm excited to be here and excited to be in this theater, which I think is great. What I wanted to do was really to talk about some legal limitations when vendors are selling to hospitals. I'm going to go off script a little bit because I really wanted to follow up on the continuum of what our last panel talked about. And the thing that I found really interesting about their conversation was we talked about clinical champions, we talked about different types of roadblocks that companies may encounter when dealing with hospitals, but really what happens when you get the green light to enter into an arrangement with a hospital. And that's, fortunately or unfortunately, that's where legal comes in. And so one of the things I really wanted to do, in addition to, running through some of the regulatory and compliance challenges, was really talk about how companies and manufacturers can make that process much more efficient when you do get the green light. And so, we'll get into some of these things. I know Sarah Ann talked about a number of the hospital policies and procedures and how those really create some challenges for companies. But what I really wanted to do, at least initially, was talk about what can companies do, what can vendors do to facilitate dealing with hospitals and working with hospitals. And so there are a number of different things that I was up in the back thinking about it when they were talking. When a company does get the green light, and really one thing that they should be ready to do, from a legal perspective, is really have contract documents ready to go. And so what that means is have your contract templates ready. Whether it's a clinical trial agreement, if you're working with a CRO, have those ready to go. If you're a software company and you've got a SaaS platform, have those contracts ready to go. If it's just a regular purchasing or vendor agreement, have it ready to go. And there are a number of different things that go into those. And so take some time up front and work on those documents, because more often than not, the hospital will come to you and say, okay, give us your form. And so you don't want to have any delays putting together a form. So have it ready, spend some time on it. And there are two real reasons why that's important. One is because it ensures and establishes credibility with the hospital. You're going into a partnership with them, and you want to present to them a document that reflects, frankly, a thorough and comprehensive analysis of the potential issues that you may face. The other thing really is it speeds up the internal review process. And I don't know whether we have, any internal hospital folks who have to deal with, in-house legal, but one of the goals is really to get things through in-house legal. And I work with both hospital systems as well as with manufacturers and other suppliers. And so I can come at it from both sides. And one of the things that I see, at least in dealing with the hospital in-house folks, is that if there's a poor contract that's presented by a vendor, it takes much more time to get through review. And so that will really delay the process of getting your product implemented. So take some time, think about it, put in the work on the front end. The second thing that I think companies need to think about really is just the role of in-house legal at a hospital system. And their role is much different than it could be for purchasing or for the clinical folks. And so one of the things that we typically do when we're working, as outside counsel to hospitals is, we will uncover other legal issues and ask different questions than the clinical folks may ask. A lot of the clinical folks are very, very knowledgeable about legal issues, and we'll get through a number of these, but the panel talked about a number of different things that are really issues these days. One is data privacy and data security. In-house legal folks are focusing much more on that, and there are a number of different reasons for that. I mean, you can read the news and see the data breaches that happen every day and the dollars that are associated with that. I mean, unfortunately, that wasn't one of the things that I put in my deck, but that's a real concern that a lot of companies should be thinking about. The other thing that in-house legal and outside counsel will be thinking about are various compliance issues. And we'll go through a couple of those in our deck. But I think it's important for the manufacturers and the vendors to know that the role of in-house legal is really to manage risk. And so if you go into those conversations with legal, understanding that that's their principal role, you have contracts that are tight and that are reasonable, it makes the process go much more smoother and much more efficiently and gets your product into the hospital much quicker. Now, one final thing that I wanted to mention as well, building off of the prior conversation and just talking a little bit about privacy and security, one thing that newer early stage companies don't really think about, at least initially, is the importance of insurance. And so one of the things that I typically work with my early stage companies, and frankly even later stage companies, is making sure that they are properly insured. Because one of the key issues that any hospital in-house legal folks will talk about and the risk management teams will think about are what type of insurance do these companies have. So again, give some thought to that up front. It takes some time to get that, because if you start entering into a contract negotiation, one of the things that hospitals will typically come back with are, show us what your coverages are. And more hospitals now are requiring data and privacy security policies or cybersecurity policies, product liability, and even clinical trial insurance. And so patient safety is always going to be a key. That's one key, one consideration. Data security is always going to be another consideration that I think you need to focus on as well. So I wanted to kind of get these sort of concepts out there, more because it was more of a continuum of the discussion that we were just having. But really wanted to kind of focus a little bit more on what I would call sort of some of the legal limitations that manufacturers typically face. I mean, what I just went through are a little more on the obstacle side, but again, things that most companies should be thinking about as they embark on relationships with hospitals. So in terms of my prepared remarks, I really wanted to focus more on laws, policies, and other restrictions that might impact vendor relationships with hospitals. Some of the ones that I'll run through, generally very quickly, and what I want to do is kind of run through these general concepts and then save some time at the end for questions, because I find that Q&A session to be a little more helpful and educational for audiences. So we'll talk a little bit about fraud and abuse laws. We'll talk about Sunshine Act requirements, industry guidelines, and then Sarah Ann already referenced the hospital policies and procedures. I mean, those are important considerations that I think, from her comments and her remarks, I think everyone understands, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So unfortunately, there's good news, bad news. In terms of the bad news, these are some of the statutes that hospitals and vendors need to worry about, at least on the federal side. There are a lot of statutes on the state side too. We'll talk about a couple of these, anti-kickback statute being the principal one, although Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, we'll just mention that a little bit too, to the extent that any vendors here are dealing internationally. Now, in terms of the federal anti-kickback statute, that's the principal statute that's making it in the news these days, when you see a lot of big settlements for fraud and abuse laws and fraud and abuse violations. Essentially, what the anti-kickback statute is designed to prevent is a vendor making a payment or anything of value in return for a referral of patients for items or services that are going to be covered by a federal health care program. So Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, or the buying, leasing, or arranging or recommending of any items or services. We'll get into some of the nitty-gritty and some of the particulars about how this statute is actually applied. Again, severe criminal and civil penalties or violations. If you read the news or the newsletters, I mean, when you have anti-kickback violations and False Claims Act violations, we're talking, frankly, in the hundreds of millions of dollars for a lot of these companies. Now, in terms of the basic elements of a kickback violation, you're going to need remuneration. And essentially that is anything of value. Could be tangible, could be intangible. A couple of examples would be free or discounted equipment, training, low interest loans, travel expenses, CME courses. We'll talk a little bit more when we get into some of the particulars, but free travel, gifts and entertainment, free meals, those are the big ones. There's no de minimis exception, so anything of value will apply. And the inducement It really goes to what is the purpose that a company is making that payment or transfer of value. And it could be, there's a one purpose rule. And so you could be making a payment or entering into an arrangement that may have a number of different purposes. There could be patient education purposes. There could be a grant making purpose. If one purpose of that payment is to encourage or obtain or influence the use of your product, that's enough to trigger the statute. Importantly, when we talk about the elements, the intent, you don't need to have intent to violate the statute. You have to have intent, but all it requires is that you know about there's an intent to induce referrals. So if there is one purpose or one intent to induce referrals, that's enough. You don't have to have actual knowledge that you're committing a violation, but if you're intending to induce a referral, that's enough. And again, it covers any covered item or service, any item or service that's paid for in whole or in part by a federal health care program, typically Medicare, Medicaid, and TRICARE. So when we unpack sort of what some of the major violations are, and we'll run through a couple of pages of settlements in the next couple minutes, the specific industry relations that DOJ, OIG, and state enforcement officials are focused on are right here. Gifts and entertainment, samples, discounts, rebates, and coupons. Travel's a big one. Travel to CME is always an interesting one. Physician advisory and consulting arrangements, speakers bureaus, and there's a few others that we'll touch upon as well. In terms of recent enforcement actions, again, I've got a few pages of these. We can kind of skim through them. I tried to include mostly device manufacturers, but pharmaceutical companies are certainly in the crosshairs as well. Now, the important thing, you can just look at Medtronic, for example. Sham consulting arrangements, sham royalty arrangements, lavish trips. So what I'm here to say is that the bad news is that there are companies out there still that are doing these things, and the penalties can be severe. You're looking at fines and penalties that could potentially cripple a company, and frankly, some people are looking at jail. So it's important to really get your arms around these concepts. We'll talk a little bit about compliance, I think, in the next panel, about what you can do to make sure you're aware of these restrictions and how you can comply to make sure that you're on the right side of things. So at least when I talk with my clients about what the takeaways are for anti-kickback compliance, it's really just trying to make sure that the arrangements that you're entering into will not be deemed to be sham arrangements to purchase loyalty. And so really the touchstones are going to be focus on what the fair market value of the compensation may be or the remuneration may be. It's okay to compensate a person for time and effort, but if those payments are excessive or they appear to be designed to encourage loyalty, to encourage the use or induce the use of a drug or a product, that's where things go over the line. Again, this is nothing new. FDA and OIG and CMS and DOJ, they're extremely concerned about off-label use. There's a whole string of cases about companies that are prescribing or encouraging docs to prescribe for off-label use. Again, just something to think about. CME is a big issue. The issue there is, does the CME program, is it meant to influence, is the industry sponsorship meant to influence content? And again, that really relates to providing truthful and accurate information as opposed to providing lavish trips, lavish meals, all sorts of other spending and freebies for docs to encourage them or induce them to prescribe your product. So what can we do, or what do I work with clients on doing to make sure that we can structure these relationships appropriately? And one of the key issues, at least for early stage companies, is really trying to identify and work with potential advisors. And it could be consultants within industry. It could be physicians or other doctors who may be able to provide some type of service for development of the product. again, those types of collaborations can produce important medical advances. But again, you need to ensure that any compensation, and whether it's cash, whether it's equity, then there are a number of different types of equity. It's sort of a subject for a different conversation, but you need to ensure that it's fair and appropriate and commercially reasonable. So there are, industry benchmarks that we typically look at when we're structuring these arrangements. There are consultants that do fair market valuations. The important thing is that you should avoid any appearance that these payments are intended to curry favor, so that the doc or the institution could use your device or would use your device or product. Now, the last piece is very important to ensure compliance with the kickback safe harbors. If you are going to go out and enter into some type of arrangement, make sure that the arrangement's documented, and it's really going to define all the services that your advisor is going to perform, define that person's qualifications or expertise, and again, ensure that whatever comp is going to be paid is going to be fair market value, and it's not going to be tied to the volume or value of possible referrals. Now, just going back here for 1 second too, and we'll touch upon this when we get to the potential hospital policies and procedures. Now, one thing that you should be aware of, whether you're an advisor or whether you're potential advisor or a company, is make sure that if your advisor is employed by either an academic institution or a hospital or other healthcare system, that those folks, those individuals, check their own policies and procedures, their internal policies and procedures for potential conflicts of interest. And so it's potentially a company issue, but it's a bigger issue for the potential advisor. And so there are certainly, most institutions have conflict of interest policies, conflict of interest guidelines that they should run and get approval for those types of relationships before they enter into them. Saves a lot of headaches for unwinding those relationships after the fact. So just real quick about another federal statute that is coming into the news over the last several years or so, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Again, it applies only to public companies, and it applies to those public companies who are doing business internationally. And essentially, it's similar to the federal anti-kickback statute. Prevents those companies from bribing officials in other countries to obtain, direct, or retain business. Again, next slide is just a couple of examples of companies that have been tagged with these types of violations. Again, big dollars. And so we've seen a few over the last several years, and it's across the board, pharma, med device, software companies as well. So just want to take a quick survey. Are folks here, do we have manufacturers here right now who are complying or supposed to comply with the Sunshine Act requirements? I don't know if we have any hands go up. We've got a few over there. These requirements have been in place for a couple of years now. They were effective March of 2013 with the first reporting period the following year. This particular framework has created just a lot of headaches for a lot of different people. And there are a number of folks in the industry and even within the government who are questioning whether it really solved anything, given all the problems that have come to light about the reporting and really the quality of the data. But this is an important consideration for manufacturers who, and we'll get into it in a few seconds about who are the covered manufacturers and what the requirements are. But it's an important consideration to the extent that you are a manufacturer and you are going to be transferring any value to what's called a covered recipient. And it's going to be a teaching hospital or a physician. And so to the extent that you're going to be transferring value, whether it's through de minimis gifts or small value gifts, which we'll talk about, or any other type of payment, it needs to be reported to CMS. I really just wanted to focus on the first bullet point there, the disclosure of payments and other transfers of value to physicians and teaching hospitals. The second bullet point is important for those physicians who do have ownership interests. And again, that may be a consideration, but I really wanted to, for this audience, but I wanted to focus on the first bullet point. So an applicable manufacturer is an entity engaged in the production, preparation, compounding, or conversion of a covered drug. And a covered drug is any item for which payment is available under federal health care program, Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, and which requires either a prescription to be dispensed or a pre-market approval to the FDA. In terms of the actual logistics, on March 31st of each calendar year, beginning in 2014, all the manufacturers who were covered manufacturers had to disclose information about payments and transfers of value. And the intent here, just stepping back for a minute, the intent was CMS and various government regulators were getting concerned about payments and transfers of value to industry participants, whether it's hospitals or whether it's physicians who are, in turn recommending or prescribing drugs or devices or other products. And so in an effort to increase transparency and reduce potential conflicts of interest, they decided to, frankly model some of this after some states that had done similar measures. And the result is the Open Payments website. You can punch it up right now. You can search, the data that's been in there. You can manipulate it, check your own zip code and see which docs are getting or hospitals are getting payments from applicable manufacturers. Now, in terms of actually reporting, what manufacturers need to really track and monitor are whether any payments or transfers of value are being made to any covered recipient, so outside physician or a teaching hospital. Transfer of value is interpreted broadly or defined broadly. I mean, it could include virtually any transfer of value or any payment. This is from the statute, simple, bullet point list of different types of transfers that would need to be reported. Again, the big ones: consulting fees, royalty payments, gifts, entertainment at meals, travel, trip expenses, CME. Now, in terms of the types of payments, I didn't want to get too far into the weeds on it, but there are two types. One are general payments and one are payments for research. Just something to be aware of, because there are distinctions within the statute that are important if you actually do have to comply with these requirements. What data should be reported to the Open Payments portal? All sorts of identifying information. The big ones would be a description of the nature of the payment or the transfer of the value. There are some exceptions. Transfers of value less than $10, although there is a inflation mechanism, and so the transfer of value amount this year is $10.22. If it's going to be multiple transfers of value, the annual limit is $100. Product samples intended for patient use, those are accepted as well. Again, don't resell samples. Patient education materials that directly benefit patients. Loans of devices for trial periods, that's an interesting one that some of our clients take advantage of. Or items or services provided under contractual warranties. And then certain discounts as well. The penalties for failure to report, again, it's just one more thing that regulated healthcare companies have to deal with in terms of regulatory compliance and penalties for not being in compliance. They can add up. I was looking recently. I know in the first year or two that they were measuring or tracking this information, no one was fined or penalized for the failure to report. That may still be the case. I haven't seen data for recent data. So, I mean, whether companies are actually being fined, it's a little unclear, but doubtful. It's few and far between, if any. But I think the implications for covered recipients are huge. And you may have seen some of the fanfare, the news articles about when the open payment system first came online and CMS disclosed that information was available. And there were any number of articles that were written where newspapers went and searched online for various doctors or various companies in certain geographic locations and learned that, hey, lo and behold, this particular doctor was getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from a particular manufacturer. And that's really the last bullet point. I mean, those payments could, entirely legitimate for legitimate services that were performed. But yet, the reputational risk to providers is huge because it gives off the appearance of impropriety. And so that's one of the issues that covered recipients have to really contend with. And as a manufacturer, that's one of the things that you need to contend with as well, because you'll need to track those payments that are being made and report. And that's where the first two bullets come into play, because to the extent you are reporting accurately, that could potentially provide a little bit of a roadmap to government enforcement or even whistleblowers to take a closer look at those payments and try and figure out, hey, are these payments legitimate, or are they designed to induce referrals and are violations of fraud and abuse laws? So again, just something to think about. It's just one more regulatory burden that those in the industry have to face. Real quickly, so we do want to save some time for Q&A. There are other industry-sponsored guidelines that manufacturers do comply with. The chief one, at least for device manufacturers and med tech, being the AdvaMed code. Again, it's a voluntary code. If you look up, hit that website, you'll see the various manufacturers that are members of AdvaMed and agree to comply with that. Sarah Ann talked about this in some detail in the prior conversation. The hospital policies and procedures and really figuring out what those are is really a key consideration, because if you can't comply with these, you won't get in the door. So vendor credentialing and registration, I pulled some of these right off of one of the local institutions, and so pre-scheduled appointments, vendor training, gift policies, they're all there. You can find them, they're online. No gifts including meals, no use of facility phones. Some have no distribution of any material whatsoever. So I know I ran through a number of different regulatory burdens, and you may come away thinking, geez, why am I in this business? And if I have to comply with all these requirements. But, the good news about this is that these regulatory burdens and these compliance issues really create a lot of opportunities for startup companies and technology companies to provide solutions to some of these issues. And so, you look at the open payments, and there are a number of software companies that have developed around the facilitating reporting requirements. And so these are opportunities for new companies to come into the market based upon these regulatory obligations. And so we look at, just to give you one quick example, so the vendor credentialing and registration. There's a company out there right now that created a platform that got very good traction and took off and was sold over the last couple of years for, I think, $220 million. And so there are opportunities out there to facilitate, compliance with these types of regulatory obligations, whether it's vendor credentialing, whether it's revenue cycle management, whether it's data privacy and data security. The burdens create opportunities. And so to the extent that, if you're a manufacturer, you need to be aware of these things, but you can also create products and services that facilitate hospital systems compliance with these issues as well.